Thank you very much for having me, and thank you, David and Grace, for organizing this wonderful workshop and coordinating our visit. So my topic today is major transitions in cognitive evolution and the role of resource constraints in major transitions. So in 2020, I began a collaboration with the neuroethologist Andrew Barron, who works on bee cognition at Macquarie University, and Colin Klein, a philosopher at the Australian National University, on this project, Major Transitions in Cognition. And since 2020, our team has grown. We have a group of postdocs and PhD students, as well as some additional international collaborators who have just joined the project, such as Sue Healy, who works on hummingbird cognition at the University of St. Andrews, and Brian Hare, who works on dog cognition at Duke University. So we're really excited to explore this idea of major transitions in cognition. So what I'm going to talk about today is our specific proposal regarding how we should think about major transitions in cognition and the role of resource constraints in this account. And this talk, we don't have that much time. This talk is based on a forthcoming paper in Proceedings B. So if you'd like to see more details regarding this particular account, please feel free to check out the paper. So I'd like to begin by motivating the project, and there are quite a few reasons why we wanted to engage in this project, but one that is close to my heart because I work in the field of comparative cognition, so I've done studies on great ape gestural communication and social cognition, and I work closely with Nikki Clayton in the Corvid lab at the University of Cambridge. So that's the perspective I'm coming from comparative psychology or comparative cognition. So I just want to present this motivation in terms of out-of-the-box thinking, or how major transitions can help us engage in out-of-the-box thinking. So often comparative cognition researchers start by noting some capacity, sophisticated, often complex cognitive capacity that we might have observed in humans. So we know humans are one form of biological intelligence. They adapt flexibly to new situations, solve a wide range of problems, engage in complex social situations, and more. And one standard approach in comparative cognition is to identify some organisms as having these human-like capacities, these flexible capacities to adapt to a variable environment, and then explore whether they use the same cognitive capacities to engage in this flexible behavior, like causal reasoning, imagination, future planning, episodic memory, etc. And then this is often contrasted, these complex cognitive abilities are often contrasted with capacities that are thought to lead to more rigid behavior. Sometimes people refer to innate behavioral programs, but more often associative learning is the kind of contrast case to complex cognitive capacities, like causal reasoning. A lot of researchers have recently pointed out this framing and that it's very limited. So here's one example in the context of causal cognition. Tobias Starshek and Russell Gray note that over and over again, the familiar refrain is, do animals have complex human-like cognitive abilities, or can their behavior be explained in terms of simpler processes such as associative learning? So I think I'm probably singing to the choir here in terms of that we need to move beyond this kind of dichotomy. And this was pointed out yesterday by František Beluska, saying that this approach is a kind of top-down human-first approach, and that we should be taking a different kind of approach that perhaps looks at information processing architectures and biological mechanisms first, and then builds up an account of an explanation of behavior from that. And others, even Franz de Waal has argued for this, what he calls a bottom-up approach that's more grounded in neuroscience, and I am very sympathetic. I think this is the right way to go to move away from it. But we do provide a specific way of moving away from more binary thinking in terms of major transitions in cognitive evolution. So what are these? Broadly, major transitions in cognition for us are qualitative changes in information flow, with each transition opening up new cognitive capacities. So the idea is that such a framework could provide us with a way of comprehending the diversity of intelligences we see in the world. And in our particular case, we do focus on nervous systems, but I don't see any reason, I think, and Colin and Andy agree that there's no reason to limit ourselves to nervous systems. And this conference for me has been a really rich source of examples of non-neural systems engaging in learning, memory, communication, what I would call cognitive abilities, and embodied cognition. And I think, it would be great if we could include that in a major transitions and cognitive evolution approach. But I'm happy to discuss that over coffee. Okay, so for those who are not familiar with major transitions, I'm using this term, what does it mean? So it's inspired and follows to some degree the major transitions approach used in evolution, first proposed by John Maynard Smith and Urs Saathmari in the 1990s. And according to Smith and Saathmari, major transitions in evolution include a host of changes, and they often include new levels of biological organization. So they result in new levels of biological organization. And the consequences of a transition are profound for both the organism and the biosphere. So major transitions for Maynard Smith and Saathmari are more than evolutionary significant novelties. They emphasize several features of major transitions, like the fact that they're contingently irreversible. They increase centralized hierarchical control. They enhance the division of labor in a system. And they open up new ways of transmitting information. So these were some of the features that they highlighted in their account. Now, I don't think we have to follow the major transitions framework exactly. And there's been much discussion in philosophy of science about how to understand major transitions in evolution. And the two of these papers are quite recent, and I think it's kind of becoming a topic that people are re-engaging. What is a major transition? How should we understand it? Should we limit the term to certain events, and if so, which events? But I like Brett Calcott and Kim Strelny's point when they say that the major transitions model is heuristically powerful, for it forces us to ask important questions about the conditions of change and the stability of those conditions. So it's in this spirit that we're proposing a major transitions account of cognition. So there are already accounts of major transitions in cognitive evolution in the literature. Not a lot, but two very prominent ones are that advanced. I'm very excited to be following a talk by Eva Jablonka. So one prominent account is advanced by Simona Ginsberg and Eva Jablonka, and another one by Daniel Dennett. So we do build on some of these accounts, especially Ginsberg and Jablonka's, for our account, but we also diverge at certain points. And I'll come back at the end when talking about resource constraints on where the divergence is. Okay, so these are our 5 major transitions in cognitive evolution that we're tentatively proposing for our framework. And the most important thing to point out is that these transitions involve a change in structure and function of neural or cognitive architectures. So we do talk about cognitive architectures or information flow, but both Andy and I are grounded in biology, and so we're often looking at the actual structure of nervous systems, but we're also thinking about it abstractly in terms of cognitive architectures. So the changes for us, these changes are cumulative in the sense that they change the evolutionary trajectory of an organism. However, critically, they're not progressive. So changes include losses as well as gains, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But what is possible before a transition, so what is possible might not be possible after a transition, it's simply that the space of possibility has changed. And we do think these transitions do involve some contingent irreversibility, not because the unit of reproduction has changed, but because once a lineage has undergone a transition, the new features of the lineage are often entrenched. And I hope that will become clearer as I give some examples. So yeah, let me now just describe a few of the transitions so you have a sense of what we mean. Now, I don't think I really need to start by saying this at a workshop like this, but it's important to note that neurotransmitters like dopamine, epinephrine, and others are found widely across the biological world, so there's no clear difference once you have nervous systems versus not. But we do think that an important transition is the transition to decentralized nervous systems, or when organisms start using neurons to accelerate communication between different parts of their body. So neural networks such as these are found in organisms like the starlet sea anemone and box jellyfish. And the presence of such networks, as some people in the audience have written about, allows coordinated action and modulation of coordinated action by environmental demands in an organism. And again, I do want to highlight that such networks can take many different forms, so they can be electrical, chemical, biophysical, but we think that as animals get larger, operating speed and preservation of signal over distance becomes more important, and so neural networks are needed. So if we go back to the Ediacaran 635 to 545 million years ago, it's likely that relatively simple neural topologies like these networks were crucial for the adaptability and evolvability of large-bodied mobile animals. So our next transition is the evolution of centralized nervous systems. Organisms with such cognitive architectures, we would include organisms such as the nematode worm here, like C. elegans, flatworms, leeches, and simple mollusks. So here what we have is integrated rather than decentralized feed-forward information flow. There's also radical transformation in sensory motor abilities due to these clusters. So centralization enables specialized senses like eyes and specialized limbs like legs, which in turn enable new forms of engagement with the environment. Inputs from specialized senses are combined, and decision systems use this integrated information as input into other systems. And centralized coordination, such as this, enables complex and varied forms of movements for large-bodied organisms. So centralization also enables new forms of learning, and we saw this a bit yesterday. So we can compare these to feed-forward neural networks, where information is processed with few feedback connections, in which the outputs of the network are fed back onto itself. But even when you have a feed-forward network like this, it's incredibly powerful, used for classification, again, as was noted yesterday. And so we expect that organisms with feed-forward centralization to be able to engage in sophisticated forms of learning, like second-order conditioning, multimodal learning, and generalization. And we can trace the evolution of centralization to the Cambrian period, about 500 million years ago. So here we have systems. These kinds of systems are able to engage in predation and sophisticated predator evasion. And this is where we're drawing on Ginsberg and Jablonka, who have argued that centralization of nervous systems at this time led to a massive increase in adaptive behaviors, such as habitat selection and niche construction. So in other words, the move from network to centralization transformed the space of biological possibility, leading to the emergence of new forms of biological diversity. So I think I have time for a third final example, which is recurrence. And I was very excited to see Jordy's talk yesterday, and I hope we can draw out those parallels a bit more. So a centralized network, under our account, is just a feed-forward network, more or less. It's not a clear line or all or nothing. But a recurrent network incorporates feedback into later stages, from earlier stages of processing to, from later stages to earlier stages of processing. And recent work on insect connectomes emphasizes the degree in which they're dominated by recurrence in a way that's not found in C. elegans. So this is something that Andrew Barron has argued, and he thinks that this is why insects, like bees, are capable of certain capacities, like the type of learning, memory, and navigation that they engage in. And then there are other organisms who have an insect or something similar to an insect mushroom body, like the mantis shrimp, who engage in kind of similar feats of spatial memory and navigation. And under our view, it would be the recurrent structure that you find in the mushroom body that plays an important role in this. So whether this structure has been phylogenetically conserved across crustaceans and insects, or whether the mantis shrimp and insects independently underwent this major transition is unclear to my knowledge. Maybe there's been more recent research on this, but I think it was unknown fairly recently. But what's important for our view is just that this recurrent architecture introduces new forms of learning and behavior and new evolutionary possibilities. So I just want to emphasize, and so here's some of Andy's work on this, I just want to emphasize that recurrence is not just feedback. So arguably all organisms do have feedback from the consequences of their actions on the environment, but we're thinking of recurrent systems as internalized so that the outputs of the later stages of processing, again, feed into the earlier stages in a way that changes the operation of the system. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that our account of major transitions in cognition differs from other accounts in some key respects. One important difference concerns how we explain how major transitions occur. So our view is that major transitions in cognition are best explained by appealing to resource constraints and the fact that they're sources of evolvability. So those 2 points are crucial for our account. And this is in contrast to pointing out the adaptive advantages conferred by individual cognitive capacities. Let me explain by giving an example. So one account of major transitions that's well known is Daniel Dennett's, which is this tower of generate and test. So for example, he points to Skinnerian creatures as being quite crucial as a form of learning that's evolved, and includes that in his account of a major transition. So the evolution of Skinnerian creatures or creatures capable of conditional learning. So we absolutely agree that conditional learning has numerous adaptive advantages, but we think that any major transitions account that focuses on such adaptive advantages of particular cognitive abilities as drivers for evolution face a dilemma. So let me just say this first. So here's the dilemma, if the new capacity arose because it was beneficial at the time, it's beneficial to engage in conditional learning, then this seems like ordinary natural selection. You're just selecting for the cognitive capacity or the learning ability. On the other hand, if the new capacity benefited only downstream lineages by what it enabled, so it was a benefit later on, then it remains a mystery why it evolved, what led to its evolution if its benefits came later. And so this dilemma can be understood as a teleological fallacy, so this is the way that Michael Tressman puts it. He says that rigorous biological explanation must avoid the teleological fallacy of explaining evolutionary change in terms of the adaptive benefits that the change would later make possible after further modification. So we think our approach avoids this dilemma by avoiding thinking of transitions in terms of adaptive advantages of particular cognitive capacities that emerge later on due to a change in cognitive architecture. And instead, we focus on resource constraints. And I was very excited to see Pamela's talk yesterday because we're also very much inspired by Sterling and Laughlin's principles of neural design. And the general idea that resource considerations do place important constraints on biological design space, arguably leading to many forced solutions. So to give some non-neural examples, some computer models suggest that the early evolution of vascular plants involved optimizing across several biological tasks, like maintaining mechanical stability, conserving water, and intercepting light, so that this led to the structures, some of the structures that we see today. Similarly, physical and chemical factors, such as what is needed to overcome time and distance constraints on diffusion, have played a key role in explaining the evolution of cardiovascular systems in animals. So we do think the same is true for nervous systems. Brains are, as we hear, energetically expensive and have evolved under extreme tight metabolic constraints. Sterling and Laughlin note that many strategies like local processing, sparse coding, wire minimizing topologies, and others seem to be forced solutions to metabolic demands. So one should expect considerable evolutionary pressure to do the same cognitive tasks more efficiently. So in the paper we explain, or as part of this project, we've been explaining how the transitions occur based on one important factor being these resource constraints. Oh, perfect, thanks. So for example, with decentralized neural architectures, simple diffuse nerve networks like those found in Hydra are thought to have evolved about 540 million years ago. And the advantage of nervous systems, as I noted earlier, is that they can send and receive signals quickly and over long distances, but a major disadvantage is metabolic cost. It's very expensive to use neurons. Chemical diffusion, in contrast, is relatively cheap, but is slower and shorter lived. So, we've seen a lot of examples of these, or a lot of examples of this yesterday and today. You can think of E. coli having memory, for example, by enzymes blocking the sensitivity of receptors, but this lasts only about a second. And bacteria, though bacteria in this example are fairly short-lived, and so quick signaling like that or short signaling might work out perfectly fine. And like a chemical messenger can diffuse through bacteria in about 4 milliseconds, so it's very effective as a messenger. And this is a great YouTube channel for those who don't know it, Journey to the Microcosmos. I was going to show paramecia just so you can enjoy the pretty pictures, but I think I'll just skip ahead. But oops. But I do recommend that channel. So in contrast, paramecium is 100-fold longer than E. coli. So already it takes about 40 seconds for a small molecular messenger to get across it. And so here we already have a case in which using its membrane to electrical signals in its membrane to communicate is faster than a small molecular messenger, if that's needed. So as bodies get larger, and you need multiple lines of fast communication, we would expect that a neural network will be can evolve on resource constraints alone. And I just want to point out one last point that we make, which I quite like and would like to develop more. And that's the idea that, so in all of these, in our transitions, the cognitive architectures lead to new forms of learning. And Rachel Brown has this great paper where she argues that when you have learning, it increases the standing genetic variation of a population. And so And when you have a population with larger standard genetic variation, then it's more robust and adaptable. So learning leads to evolvability directly under Brown's view. So if these changes in our cognitive architecture do lead to forms of learning, then we have new forms of evolvability. All right, so I just want, we've likened this account to the periodic table, but I won't note that. So 2 take-home lessons that I would like everyone to go away with if you take anything from this, which is that we should avoid binary framings like human-like versus simple in comparative cognition, and major transitions in evolution may provide an alternative framework for understanding cognition across the tree of life. Thank you very much, and here's our website.
Okay, let's take time for a few questions. We'll cut into the break. Eric.
Yeah, so that was really, really cool. This may be a naive question, and you may have been about to talk about it but didn't have time. It strikes me that one of the things you might be able to learn is looking at convergent cases of these transitions where they occurred in multiple lineages independently as a source of information about how constraints like resource constraints sort of constrain the kinds of solutions that are generated or whatever. And I just wondering if you've looked at that or thought about that at all, because it seemed like at one of the slides, recurrence had evolved here and also here, and do they have similar architectures? Can you learn anything about the kinds of constraints that were operant at those times that might be shared, that might sort of help you understand a little bit better how resource constraints sort of do stuff anyway?
Yes, no, that's a really great point. So we haven't done that, but I think that would be a really good next step. When we've presented, or when thinking about explaining these transitions in terms of resource constraints, we do think of it as more than just like a how possibly explanation, but what Peter Godfrey Smith refers to at one point, how likely in a world like ours explanation. So we do think we definitely want to ground this in what we know, even though it's very spotty, about the evolution of organisms, and I think that would be the way to do it, as well as maybe some computational modeling. Yeah, thanks.
Another question, then we'll have the question in the back.
Hi. My question is, you mentioned about how associative learning or Skinnerian approaches are like a contrast to your proposal. But I came from a background in which people kind of integrate both, like you have ecology and you have the associative learning paradigm. And I always consider them complementary, like they were trying to answer different type of questions. If you want, one is trying to find the how and the other one the why. So I don't know if you have a thought of why necessarily has to be like this, like against each other type of approach.
Yes, great, thank you. Yes, I think they're absolutely complementary. The only difference is how the transition is explained. So rather than pointing to Skinnerian creatures or conditional learning, operational conditioning as useful for an organism, and so therefore we would expect that transition to occur, we want to say we shouldn't do that. Yes, it's absolutely beneficial to the organism, and that might lead to its entrenchment and even selection once the cognitive architecture that is required for it to take place is in place. But the transition to that cognitive architecture is best explained by appealing to resource constraints or increases in standard genetic variation that would lead to evolvability, that fits the major transition framework better. But this leads to questions of what to call a major transition at all. And so we're trying to say that, well, to really count as a major transition, we should think about it this way. But somebody could say we should have a more expansive view.
Okay, we have a question from the back here.
Great stuff, and thinking about this approach and the design principles approach, just because you and the people in this room don't have enough to do, I'm now thinking about how the evolution of nervous systems might be complementary to or or interact with other information processing systems. Certainly hormones, maybe immune systems, like are there principles of endocrine system design? Are there major transitions in immune systems?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think that it would be helpful to look at other systems, and I'm personally a proponent of embodied and active cognition, so I feel a bit uncomfortable talking about nervous systems as if, you know, they're the only thing that's important for behavior. But I'm hoping that we can look at these motifs in other systems, not just in neural systems. But I think if we can make a good case that we should think of cognition in terms of major transitions, then I think maybe some of these other options could be explored, because people often think of major transitions still as, and argue that they should be thought of as changes in individuality, in which case you're not going to be thinking of systems within an organism as a major transition, but we do think it is very helpful to think of it that way, and I don't see why you couldn't think of other systems that way too. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for